I think this is the 12th in our series of webinars, and this is going to be the last one for a while. We need to have a rest. Just to let you know that I'm still William Stockdale, and I'm still chair of Thornley Street History Group. Tonight's presentation is by Mike Haken, and Mike is chair of the Roman Roads Research Association. And Mike's going to give us a really informative and interesting talk tonight. And his topic is the Romano British A1 project, a potential evidence for an early fortified route into Brigantia. Okay, so as usual, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A box. Don't use chat. We try to keep chat just if we have any technical problems that we need informing of. We're going to be time limited again, so if you do put a question in and it doesn't get answered, I'm sorry, but we only do have a certain amount of time. Right, I'll now hand you over to Mike.
Thanks to all Roads to the Past for inviting me to speak this evening. In the past 2 decades, new and reassessed evidence has suggested that many early Roman military sites in the north may be earlier than the AD 71 to 2 dates usually assumed. Indeed, Pete Wilson has published 2 papers summarising this evidence. Over the last 3 years, however, the Roman Roads Research Association has been conducting research into the roads and the sites along what is often believed to be the primary corridor of Roman penetration north in and around AD 71, a route that stretches for over 100 miles from Lincolnshire northwards to Scotch Corner and beyond. The route is broadly similar to our modern A1, hence the title of the project and of this talk. Whilst not originally the intention, this work has revealed further circumstantial evidence for early activity, specifically for a possible Roman fortified route into Brigantian territory that existed before it was annexed by Rome in the early AD 70s. The work has all been conducted by a dedicated band of volunteers with LiDAR analysis, drone photography, and substantial geophysical survey using our own equipment. Geophysics training and supervision was provided by James Lyle, and I think he touched on his work with us in a previous talk for Roads to the Past. The map you should now be able to see shows the possible military dispositions in around about AD 55 on the northern edge of Roman control. Now, older history books and some modern websites will tell you that the Fosse Way, that's that road there, represented the original frontier, but that is clearly not the case. In reality, there was no formal limes, i.e. frontier. The extent of Roman control merely approximated to the valley of the River Trent. So behind the river were the northwest end of Watling Street, that's there, and the northeastern end of the Fosse Way. The line of settlements along the Fosse Way, which are marked in grey, may have developed from military sites, although the only firm evidence for this is actually at East Stoke, which is there, which was known to the Romans as Ad Pontum. Along the Trent Valley in advance of the roads is a line of 4 so-called Vexilation Fortresses. Each one's big enough for a vexilio, that's half a legion. That's Newton-on-Trent, Osmondthorpe, Broxtowe, and down here at Kimberston. The poorly understood site at Strutt's Park in Derby could actually be a 5th, that's there, and you can see from the disposition of them, there could well be a missing one, a 6th, somewhere between Derby and Kimberston. At the end of the line, the legionary fortresses of Wroxeter and Lincoln may actually be slightly later. That's why they're marked with question marks in them. We're not sure of the dates of them, although it is probable that the 14th and 19th legions respectively were active at these sites roughly around about this time. They just might not have been full-blown legionary fortresses. The frontier zone, for want of a better phrase, it's not a good one, it's the best I've got, approximates to the pale orange band, although until around about AD 60 the western area in Wales was very diffuse, to say the least. To the north was the vast territory of the Confederation of the Brigantes, whose main centre was at Stanwick, that's all the way up here, north of Richmond, North Yorkshire. And alongside the Brigantes, we had the Parisii, in what is modern-day East Riding. Both were probably client kingdoms, allowed to maintain their independence in return for the provision of military security along the border of empire. In AD 51, after leading a guerrilla war against Rome for years, Caractacus had finally been defeated and sought refuge with Cartimandua, Queen of the Brigantes, who promptly handed him over to Rome. Now, we are entirely dependent here on the account of the first century historian Cornelius Tacitus for any detail, and it's fair to say that there's some confusion, since the account of events he gives in Brigantia between AD 51 and AD 69 in two books, the Annals and the Histories, vary substantially. In the Annals, he records that as a result of Cartimandua surrendering Caractacus, she and her husband Venutius divorced, with the subsequent outbreak of civil war, which the Romans quelled only with the use of cohorts. They didn't need a full legion. Yet in the Histories, he places the divorce in the year of the four emperors, AD 69, about 17 years later, and describes how Cartimandua had to be rescued by Rome. Modern historians and archaeologists disagree about the interpretation of this discrepancy, but it seems quite probable that whatever the cause, there were events in Brigantia, both in the 50s and around about AD 69, that call for Roman military intervention. Crucial for us is that Tacitus also records in the Annals a specific incident, although he doesn't actually say what it was, during the governorship of Aulus Didius Gallus, that's roughly between 52 and 57 AD, in that a legion under Caesius Nasica, almost certainly the 9th Hispana, fought a successful action in Brigantian territory. And that's all we know. However, it's really striking that modern archaeology has revealed that at some point in the mid-50s, there was also a sudden expansion northwards from the Trent into the southeast Pennines, as we'll see in this next slide. It seems perfectly reasonable to suggest that this area may have been the territory of a Brigantian sept. Remember that the Brigantes were actually probably a confederacy that was defeated by Nasica. The forts of Templeborough and Chesterfield, Templeborough there, now Rotherham, and Chesterfield, almost certainly date to this period, as may the little understood site at Pentridge, all on a line northwards from Derby, which in the medieval period became known as Ricknield Street. Similarly, a further Vexilation Fortress was built at Rossington, southeast of Doncaster, on a line northwards from Osmanthorpe. It's likely that the fort at Marton on the Trent, that's there, also dates to this period, although whether the road that branches off, that's Ermine Street, branches off Ermine Street and heads to Rossington, whether it was built at this time or just a little later is far from clear, as we'll see later. The events following the handing over of Caractacus also had an impact much closer to Cartimandua's power base at Stannick. Just southeast of Stannick is the late Iron Age settlement at Scotch Corner, just there, strategically positioned where the Stainmore Pass, it's what we now know as the A66, meets the route northwards through the Vales of York and Mowbray. Recent excavations during the A1 widening scheme have shown that substantial quantities of high-status Roman goods had been arriving at Scotch Corner right up until around about AD 55, when everything suddenly changed. Enclosures went out of use, a new ladder settlement formed, and new commodities arrived, which are generally transported through military networks, suggesting the deployment of Roman troops there. Logically, this could coincide with both the military intervention by the cohorts that Tacitus referred to rather than a legion, and with the specific actions of Nasica and the 9th Legion. We'll come back to Scotch Corner later on, but in the meantime we have to address a very specific question. Did the Roman military connection with Stannick and Scotch Corner come from the North Sea via the River Tees, as has recently been proposed by Professor Martin Millett and Rose Farraby, or did troops safely travel through potentially hostile territory, the 71 miles from Rossington, all the way up to Scotch Corner? The beginnings of the answer may actually lie with the discovery of a new road, well, new to us, which has recently been discovered down here in Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire. A short stub of this road, just the top bit, just south of Rossington, was actually already known. However, a discovery by Tim Jeffrey, one of our members, led to the realisation that it did in fact run from the Osmondthorpe Fortress, 28 miles to the south, running via Bilsthorpe, Ollerton and Blythe. The road actually shows extremely well in several places on Lidar imagery, and its course is now regarded as certain. Southeast from East Stoke, Tim and I have also managed to ascertain the road that runs from Ancaster, previously proposed by Yvonne Boutwood. Together, these give a potential line of communication to Rossington direct from the provincial capital at Colchester via Ermine Street. This new road, this bit particularly, is actually parallel to both Ricknield Street and Ermine Street, north of Lincoln, and all three could well be part of a three-pronged plan centred on the Rossington Fortress here to enable the rapid movement of parts of the two legions north into the rest of Brigantia and possibly Parisian territory. As an example, this is actually the first length of road that Tim spotted on Lidar. It's Apley Head Wood. It's northeast of Clumber Park in Nottinghamshire, if anybody knows that part of the world. For those who aren't familiar with LiDAR, it's an acronym for Light Detection and Ranging. It involves firing a laser from an aircraft to measure the distance to the ground and enables us to create very accurate three-dimensional models of the ground surface. It can reveal subtle changes in height that are totally invisible when you're stood on top of something. Like, for example, this agger. The LiDAR image on the right is a digital terrain model known as a DTM, which uses only the laser pulses that travel through all the trees and the vegetation and hit the ground below. So they create a model effectively of the soil surface. So on the right, you can see the line of the Roman road running along there as clear as a bell in the woods. 2 weeks ago, actually, we walked that and we couldn't see it at all. Not at all, which shows you the value of LiDAR. It's totally hidden underneath brambles and bracken. In a sense, the road has been hidden in plain sight by the trees, because if you look at the aerial photograph, you can understand why nobody had spotted this before. You simply cannot see it. If I click my little button, that's the line of the road, although you really wouldn't know it was there. Another example is just to the south. This is on the Thoresby estate at Pearlthorpe in Nottinghamshire. It's an excellent example of how modern roads can frequently deviate from the Roman line. You can see this on the map very, very clearly there. The red line is the Roman, the green is the A614. And if you look at the LiDAR image, you can see a short length of agger there. I should have explained the agger is the mound on which the road was built. And another length of agger, and crucially, a cutting. And you can see the very, very straight base of the cutting maintaining the alignment of those two stretches of agger. Put the three together and that can only be a Roman road. It can't be anything else. Moving now up towards Rossington, but not quite. We're just a short distance south of the Rossington Fortress. I wanted to show you this image here, which shows the road cutting through the existing Iron Age landscape. All these field systems, which are sometimes mistaken for Roman, are actually Iron Age. And you can see clearly on this plot of the aerial photograph of the crop marks showing an aerial photography, very clearly that the line passing through it. This has been published on the ADS and as a book, the crop mark landscape of the magnesian limestone by Ian Roberts. Now, if you look at the fortress, that's it at the top there, you can see that clearly it does not respect the line of the road, and that might lead you to think that the fortress came first. If we take a look at this photograph, this is from the Cambridge collection, you can actually see the road very clearly there. The fortress is roughly in that position. I just want you to note very, very quickly how the road, you can see, has in three parts. It's got a central carriageway, and then you have a shoulder each side, and beyond the shoulder a dark line which is a crop mark of the ditch. The outer shoulders are almost certainly a softer carriageway for livestock or for cavalry, and it's a common road setup, very common indeed, the ditches being just over 60 Roman feet apart, and we see them everywhere, and yet they're very rarely described in literature. I've never really understood why. So if we take a look now at the LiDAR image of Rossington, that's the road I've just shown you coming up here. We're going to take a slight diversion and look at this one. This road coming up, Roman Road 28A, is moving up from Lincoln. The whole layout is slightly baffling, and it might be best explained as having developed as plans rapidly changed in the years between AD 55 and the full-scale push northwards in AD 71. This road, the numbers, by the way, are the numbers that a chap called Ivan Margery developed. Most people will probably be familiar with them, and we use them all the time. Indeed, we're awarding our own. This one, Roman Road 282, is one we've recently awarded. It continues, as 28, northwards on 281. It's usually known as the Cantley Spur. This heads to a fort on the River Don at Long Sandal, but goes no further. It probably represents an ill-fated attempt to drive a road directly across the Humberhead levels. Now, anyone who knows the area knows how susceptible it is to flooding. It was probably realised too late that the idea of a road across there was foolhardy. Only after another fort was constructed at Roll Manor on the River Aire. We're going to look at that shortly. Interestingly, this short stub of a road here, which heads east from Roman Road 28A, we don't know where it goes, but it was almost certainly extant in the early 18th century, and not just the almost invisible bump in a field that it is today. John Warburton, on his map of Yorkshire in 1720, marks a Roman road along that line. Crucial to the story today, though, is the road that heads north-northwest from the fortress. Now, if you look at the one coming up from Osmondthorpe, you can see it's heading to the River Torn. The Torn has been straightened and almost canalised in this area, but you can see clearly on the original position of the Torn, which is where the laser pointer is, both the roads meet. The one that you can see the Agger of heading up there, that incidentally is marked as Old Road on the first Ordnance Survey maps. This is clearly the same Roman road, which then disappears under Doncaster. But crucially, the southwest side of the fortress is aligned on it. In other words, if the usual dating of the fortress, which is around about AD 55, if that's correct, then the road and the fortress may well be contemporary. Or indeed, the road could actually predate the fortress. Either way, we can say pretty conclusively that road was constructed sometime before, on or before AD 55, which is a bit of a surprise, to say the least, given that no roads are supposed to exist in Yorkshire before AD 71. Moving back to the map, we're going to move on a couple of years now. I've shown the development northwards in the west as a result of the actions by Paulinus against the Deciangli in North Wales, with new sites appearing, including a possible fort at Chester. Notice a fort, not a fortress at this stage. However, we're interested in this one, which is Roll Manor, which I've just mentioned, the possible destination of the road that was never finished, running from Rosington. And this is the geophysics plot that we undertook in 2020. It's what we call a Radiometer Survey. Some people call it magnetometry. Basically, it's measuring variations in magnetic susceptibility within the ground. We generally break from convention with our processing, showing high responses as light as opposed to the conventional dark, since we believe that it's clearer and easier to interpret. And this is not a good example to demonstrate that. I've exaggerated the contrast to enhance the image because the responses were so low and actually masked by anomalies caused by green waste having been spread all across the fields, contaminated with lots of little bits of metal, which of course is magnetic, and they all show as hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of speckles. You can see them all around there, all over the plot. The features are faint because of a very thick alluvial deposit known to be well over a metre thick. It's basically sand over the entire fort site. If you wanted ample evidence as to why you really ought not to build a road across the Humberhead levels, that is it. The fort had previously been suspected to have something called a Parabeak Entrance. This is where the outer ditch curves inwards to meet the inner one at a gate. It's a feature specific to the Flavian period. That's the 70s and most of the 80s AD. However, we can't see any evidence of this. The feature that gave rise to the idea is that little blob there, which we actually now think is just a pit. If you zoom in on it, you'll be able to see. Whilst there are trackways and enclosures all around the fort, though, there is no obvious extramural settlement. Certainly no signs of buildings outside the fort. There are internally, but not outside it. And crucially, there's no Roman road or trackway coming up from the south. Nothing coming up from Long Sandal. In short, the fort remains currently undateable, but a date from the early 60s or mid-50s cannot be currently ruled out. It's never been excavated, so we're not sure as to how long it was occupied for. This very quickly is an illustration of a Parabeak entrance. You can see how it curves round and meets the inner ditch, the outer one meeting the inner. This will become very important just in a minute. Now, moving back to Rossington and the other road that disappears under Doncaster, where does it go then? Well, could this be it? This is a Radiometer survey of two new temporary camps, newly discovered temporary camps in South Yorkshire. The two camps are probably big enough for half a legion, and they were identified by sheer chance when we were looking for the road. I can't tell you where they are, since the landowner has requested that we withhold the location, at least for the time being. Although I can tell you that Rebecca Jones, who's the leading authority on Roman camps in Britain, has been made aware of them, so we're not keeping it totally secret. I can tell you that we will be conducting limited excavation here in the hope of obtaining datable material, hopefully at some point later this year. Now, I'll mark on these, the outlines, in red and yellow. The one we're specifically interested in, however, is the red one. Note the form of gate defences known as external claviculae on this camp. These are these curved features out here. They're generally very early and quite rare in Britain. The camps, both camps, appear to be superimposed on the late Iron Age field systems. However, the early one, the red one, appears to respect this trackway running up here. It cuts through all the fields, but they don't cut across that trackway, and we'll have to ask the question, why? Now, some distance either side of this track, if you look very carefully, you can see two linears, one there and one there. The track shows all the characteristics of being Iron Age. The linears, on the other hand, look very much Roman. It's forcing us to wonder whether this is a late Iron Age trackway that was Romanized. There's always been the assumption that the Romans, when they were moving into new territory, would utilize existing tracks, but sometimes they would actually start to turn them into a Roman road, sometimes go all the way, sometimes possibly not. This might be one of those instances. Now, what's more, when you extrapolate these, the line of these ditches southwards, they meet the River Don at almost exactly the same point as the road northwest from Rossington that disappears under Doncaster. They meet at roughly the same point on the Don. That could be a coincidence, but on the other hand, it might not. Looking further north, the trackway actually takes us close, very close, to the poorly understood fort at Burgwallis. Like Romana, Burgwallis is just beyond the extent of known Roman control at the time. The site was known previously only from aerial photography and was surveyed by us in 2019 in the hope of adding a little bit of clarity. Sadly, only about a third of the fort site actually survives. The rest was destroyed by a combination of quarrying, modern buildings, and the A1, which was duelled before there was any legal requirement for archaeological intervention. In fact, the A1 is that there. There's the north carriageway. That's the southbound carriageway. As a consequence, any trace of an early road has just disappeared. Unlike at Romana, here we unquestionably do have a Flavian fort with Parabeak entrances. I've marked up that one in yellow. You can see very clearly we have phase on top of phase on top of phase, potentially 6 altogether. But the crucial one is in yellow, where you can see the Parabeak there and on the eastern gate there. Now, Gordon Maxwell argued quite some time ago that Parabeak entrances were only built by the 2nd Legion Adiutrix. His argument was actually quite compelling. The Legion arrived in Britain with a new governor, Petilius Cerialis, in AD 71, being based at Lincoln until the mid-70s, when it appears to have transferred to Chester and withdrawn from Britain in around about AD 86. Now, if Maxwell was right, and assuming that the fort was built whilst the 2nd were at Lincoln, this would give a possible date range for the Flavian fort of just a few years, roughly AD 71 to about AD 76. Now, I should point out that the identification of a fort, possibly 2, with Parabeak entrances in Wales has recently been used to call Maxwell's theory into question. But I would counter that with the observation that since the 2nd Adiutrix were known to have been stationed at Chester from AD 76, possibly even before, the presence of such features in Wales shouldn't be any particular surprise. It should actually be expected. Now, whilst it's often dangerous to attempt to understand phasing from a geophysics plot, on this occasion there is little doubt that 2 forts predate the Parabeak one, and all 3 of them are on just ever so slightly different orientations, none of which respect the line of the later Roman road, which is roughly over here. Now, we have to ask the question then, could all 3 of these forts have been built on the same site within roughly a 6-year period? At first it would seem unlikely, but as David Breeze pointed out when I delivered a short version of this talk to the Royal Archaeological Institute, forts were usually rebuilt by each new unit that was posted there. So if there were 2 changes of unit in the early 70s, 3 forts in that time frame remains possible. But the question is if. Given that there appear to be no other examples of such a rapid succession anywhere else, I would argue that this is extremely unlikely, and leads to the very strong implication that 1 or maybe 2 of the forts date from before the arrival of Cerialis in AD 71. And there's another piece of circumstantial evidence to support this thesis, and this is it. It's a coin. It's actually a silver unit of the Iceni. The Iceni were the tribe in what we now know as Norfolk and most of Suffolk, and was recently discovered about 100 meters southeast of the fort. Only a handful of Icenian coins are known in Yorkshire, and whilst it's feasible that it escaped being melted down for over 11 years after the Boudiccan rebellion, Boudica being Iceni, that again that's much less likely than it being lost before the Boudiccan rebellion. To be lost on this site before the forts existed would similarly seem highly improbable, though not impossible. As I said, it's circumstantial, but very, very interesting. Now, if the putative route to Burgwallis followed the same course as its later successor, Roman Road 28, what most people know as the Roman Ridge, it continued to skirt around the Humberhead levels. You can see on this terrain map the hills here, and the road is clearly following the edge of the hills as far as Castleford. Castleford was recorded in different documents, Roman period documents, as Legioleum, Legicium, Legentium. Take your pick. Sorry, another quick drink. Sorry about that. The Roman fort is now unfortunately entirely covered by the Roman town, leaving us few future opportunities for study. However, recent analysis of Roman coinage from Castleford by Richard Brickstock is suggestive of the deposition of at least some coins in the late AD 60s, not in the early 70s as previously thought. Making the same assumption of any early road skirting along the foothills, the next logical stage from Castleford would be at the complex Roman site at Newton Kyme. Before we get there, however, I just want to take a quick look at a survey we carried out in October 2020. I say we, I wasn't there on this one. A couple of miles south of Newton Kyme. I'm really struggling. I apologise for the croakiness. I did too much talking today. And here's the survey. It was carried out to see if there was any discernible settlement activity of the junction of the Roman road from Ilkley to Tadcaster and the Roman road north to Newton Kyme. The image isn't very clear, but the roads can actually easily be spotted when you know what to look for by the rows of quarry pits and occasional ditches. So the road from coming in from Ilkley is here, and there's a row of quarry pits. There's another on the other side, quarry pits and the ditch. That's the road heading north to Newton Kyme. Again, 2 rows of quarry pits, a ditch there. Both these roads have a ditch separation of around about 60 Roman feet, exactly the same as we saw previously at Rossington. However, a very large surprise is this. It's another road coming up the middle. It's one that nobody knew about. It was a total surprise to us. We didn't find any sign of any settlement, by the way. If there was any, it was destroyed by this quarrying that you can see there. We do not know where that road is coming from, but it is just conceivable that it could be an early road predating these two, heading towards Newton Kyme from Castleford. It would have to make a major change of alignment, however, for this to be the case. Here's the map of the roads in the area. I said it was a little bit peculiar, and clearly you can see it is. Our little bit of new road is just that bit there. Now, you might think that if somebody was coming up from Castleford, they wanted to get to Newton Kyme, they would just go straight across on that odd cut-off corner. York is up here, by the way. That odd cut-off corner heads pretty much towards Newton Kyme. We have no evidence for that, but we haven't geophysed this area yet to check, but neither have we done this area to see where this little road's going. We have plans for that, and we're actively seeking permission, so watch this space. Moving on to Newton Kyme itself, things start to get very interesting. The fort is situated at a crossing of the River Wharfe that remained in use until relatively recently as St Helens Ford, although in the Roman period there will almost certainly have been a bridge. And here is an image you've probably seen before, since it was used as in the publicity for this talk. I'm quite pleased with this. I took this photo with a drone in the very dry summer 2018. You can clearly see a road approaching through the Vicus to the south, and the features within the later large fort stand out very clearly. I have to confess, however, it was a total fluke. I just happened to be passing the site at the time, just at the right time of the evening when the light was perfect, and I happened to have the drone in the car. Fluke, nothing more than that. Now, if we look at this site from above, things start to look a little bit clearer. On a couple of days later, after the previous shot was taken, I took some more images from above. This is an orthomosaic. That's where more than 100 images in this case are actually all stitched together by some fancy software to create a single vertical image. Now you can see very, very clearly that there is a Flavian fort here too. You can see the Parabeak entrance there, clear as a bell. It's actually been suspected for a long time, but there are indications of other things going on. We're going to take a particular look at the road through the site. You can see the road as these parch marks, paler marks where the the ground has dried out much more quickly because of the road structure underneath it. But you can also see that it's made of different phases. The first one, that one marked in red, you can see is cut by the later fort, the large later fort, but it's also cut by the Flavian one. And then it makes this weird change of direction just there for no obvious reason. That's no obvious reason until you realize that it aligns perfectly with these features here. Could this potentially be an earlier fort, the remains of the defences of, that we know nothing about? It would have to be smaller than the Flavian fort if that was the case, but we can't rule it out. Now, as for the Flavian fort itself, the road I've just marked in yellow, you'll notice that it has to do a kink to actually get into the Flavian fort. This is pretty much confirming that the road in red was there first, and that the Flavian fort is indeed the second stage. The third stage takes a different line altogether, but follows the main road through the Flavian fort, the Via Principalis. Now there's actually a fourth possible road. If you can just look very closely there's a couple of very faint parch marks. There could actually be two roads parallel to each other if you look at that one as well. Unfortunately, it's impossible to determine how this fits into the sequence, if at all. It could be earlier, it could be later. We can't say with any certainty, but what we can say for certain is that there is at least one other phase before the Flavian one, and there are possibly two. There is an earlier Roman phase on this site, possibly much earlier. Now, whilst we couldn't get permission to do geophysics on the fort itself or on the Vicus, the land to the left of the medieval trackway known as Rudgate is under different ownership, and we did manage to get access to that. Indeed, we did 22 hectares of survey. Now, if you look very, very carefully, you can just make out a few very faint linear anomalies. The one I want to really draw your attention to is that one there. If you follow it round, you can just see a curve, and it comes down there. There's a second curve, however, here. And if you follow it down to that point, just there, I'll move the pointer, you can see a gap in the line. And that is the west gate of a temporary camp. On the northern edge, you can also just about make it out. There's a crop mark here, extended along there into and under, and that's the crucial thing, all the Roman forts. I'm going to add some colour to it so you can see it a bit more clearly. The black marks on here are the interpretation done also by von Boutwood, she was then of the Royal Commission. We mentioned her previously, from analysis of aerial photography, which we have now confirmed with our own geophysical survey. What we managed to establish is that the earliest camp, this one in here in the magenta, covers an area of 23.4 hectares inside its ditch. Now, if we allow 12 Roman feet inside the ditch for a slight berm and the rampart, then this site measures precisely 15 by 12 actus along its axes between the ramparts, an actus being 120 Roman feet, making it just the biggest in England. It's capable of holding anything between 11,000 and 26,000 men. That depends on which occupancy figures you use. There's much debate about the density of occupancy of camps. I don't have time to go into that now. So this could only have been built when a very large army was being assembled, ready to move north, an army of at least 11,000 men. That's an equivalent of 2 legions plus auxiliaries as a minimum. Given the clear fort sequencing, this is a bit hard to reconcile with the Flavian period in the 70s and 80s, but not impossible. Referring back to Burg Wallace and the phasing there, it remains just possible that the forts were rebuilt in quick succession, but in our view that's unlikely. If it was Flavian construction, it would almost certainly have to be from the governorship of Vitellius Cerialis in AD 71. But, and this is important, there is no evidence at all anywhere further north of Cerialis utilising an army anywhere near this size. Of course, it's possible that he was simply using it as a muster point and the army then divided into several battle groups, which would explain why we haven't got any evidence for big groups further north. However, whilst he is perhaps an unreliable source, as we've already seen, Tacitus tells us that immediately after the Boudiccan rebellion in AD 60, the then governor, Paulinus, gathered his entire army under Cambus, where he intended, in Tacitus's words, to finish off what was left of the war. Tacitus gives us no more detail at all. Since we know that only a few years before there had been military action in Brigantia, was Newtonkime the focus for an attempt to end the threat from the north once and for all, with an invasion of Brigantia that never happened, scuppered perhaps by Paulinus's known sudden and unexpected recall? We can't say with any certainty, but it remains an intriguing possibility and one which would confirm the route being used by Rome to head north to Scotch Corner and Stannick. So, very quickly, the larger of the 2 camps can only realistically date from either AD 61-ish, 60 to 61, or AD 71, no other time. So, where next? The logical next step in the journey is what was the next step in the later military apparatus, that being the fort at Rowcliffe, which is to the west of the later Roman town of Isurium Brigantum, i.e. Aldeburgh in North Yorkshire, the civitas capital of the Brigantes. The dating of the fort at Rowcliffe, which was discovered in about 1990, I think, during the A1 widening, is based upon finds from excavation in the settlement east of the fort in around 1993 to 5. And these suggested a date of about AD 71 for the establishment of the site. Although recent reassessment of the coin finds by Richard Brickstock again hints at an earlier date in the late AD 60s, just like he found at Castleford. And the Samian assemblage, Samian is a type of pottery that was really popular with the Roman military, certainly does not rule out such a date. And here is our Radiometer survey on the west, and the earlier ones carried out during the A1 works in the 1990s. Ours was done in March last year. Done in March when the weather was utterly atrocious, and half of that was done in a blizzard. Never again. So, the excavated area was only where the A1 was due to go. That's here. Crucially, that's in the extramural settlement and not the fort itself, which poses the question, how soon after the establishment of the fort did the settlement actually develop? Was that a few weeks, a month, 6 months, a year, 2 years, more? There are hints that the site could actually be a few years older than conventional thinking has suggested. The fort itself is intriguing. Mike Bishop, who compiled the original report, suggested the possibility of a proto-Deer Street running through the Vicus, roughly on this line, and crossing the River Ure a mile upstream of where the later Roman road, these days known as Deer Street, actually crossed. And his suggestion is entirely logical and is essentially what we are suggesting, although sadly our survey could find no sign of a crossing point, largely due to the depth of alluvial deposits near the river. Absence of evidence, however, is not evidence of absence. Looking very quickly at the fort itself, you can see two pairs of parallel lines, an outer one and an inner one. The original report concluded that the outer ones were defensive ditches and the inner ones trenches for the construction of a box rampart, post trenches. There are some issues with that interpretation, however. Firstly, the western defences. It appears here that the two anomalies, those two, when you get round the corner, have merged into one, and the same seems to be happening here. It's very faint, the southern one is very faint, but by the time you get to the corner you can see how they seem to be merged. Not absolutely clear, but that is the impression it's giving. Also, the magnitude of the responses from the features is extremely high in places and not consistent all the way around. This is consistent with the so-called habitation or occupation effect. That's where you get a higher magnetic response from a ditch created by detritus and rubbish thrown into it. What is also strange is that on the eastern side, the inner anomalies appear to stop at the ditch of an annex. Those inner anomalies stop there. Can you see it? That's the ditch of the annex. It runs around and curves around here, and there are the ditches on the inner ditches on the southern side. No sign of them in that stretch. If that was a box rampart, it would be rather odd for it suddenly to stop at the ditches of an annex, leaving out an entire side. To us, that makes no sense. Unlikely as it might seem, could it be that we actually have two forts, one sitting perfectly inside the other? Seems like an odd suggestion, but it's got to be a possibility. If so, this is yet again pointing to a likely earlier date than AD 71. The apparent absence of internal features, by the way, bar a few hints, is possibly simply down to the brief period of occupancy, which left little trace behind when the fort was decommissioned. I think it was around about 80 from memory. On the other hand, it has been suggested by two authorities that that could actually be due to it not being a fort at all, but possibly a supplies base. Not my area of expertise, so I'll leave that to other people to thrash out. I'm just going to go back to, I've jumped to slide too soon. I apologize for that. One thing we can say for certain, however, is that there was an earlier Roman structure on the site. Now, unfortunately, we have this huge storm drain which caused a massive magnetic response here and made it very, very difficult for us to see clearly what was going on in this area. However, what we can see is, can you just make it out? There is a linear there, and another linear at precise right angles to it there, and another one parallel to the first here, and you can just make it out cutting through the ditches there, or rather the ditches cutting through it. Now we're interpreting that as the remains of a Roman temporary camp, which was probably around about that size. We're seeing the three sides of it. It's possible that this is a construction camp from the fort, although the fact that the fort ditches cut through it make that slightly unlikely. Not impossible, but unlikely. We think it's much more likely that it's a marching camp for a unit of perhaps 1,000 men. 1,000 men is about 2 cohorts. Could those be the ones that Tacitus refers to, having to come into Brigantia in the mid-50s AD? Just a thought. From Rowcliffe, it's about 2 days' march to Scotch Corner. So where do we go now? The distance between Rowcliffe and Stanwick is just over 30 miles. And there's actually only one site, approximately halfway, which is on a slightly elevated position next to a watercourse, which was the location of choice of the Roman army. and that is Leeming. And Leeming, in fact, is almost exactly halfway between Rowcliffe and Stanwick, although it would work perfectly well if you were travelling from Rowcliffe to Scotch Corner. So where exactly is our proposed site? Well, specifically, it's somewhere about, wait for it, there. Yeah. Sadly, no archaeological work was carried out prior to the housing being built. We're currently attempting to contact landowners with a view to surveying the pasture immediately surrounding the houses. And whilst we have to try to remain optimistic, we'll find some evidence to support the theory. I confess I'm not holding out much hope. If the fort was there, it seems highly likely that it was entirely trashed when the housing was built, and there won't be anything left. If there was a vicus, it could well have been here. The same thing applies. Very quickly, but just before we move back up to Scotch Corner, I want you to have a look at the map again and note how we have relatively evenly spaced sites all the way along. All the sites we're proposing, including the original, what we think was the original proposed route through the fort at Roll Manor that way, make very even days marches all the way up to Scotch Corner and Stanwick. But now we are going to take one very, very quick look at Scotch Corner itself. These two images are taken from the published report of the archaeological work that was undertaken there by Northern Archaeological Associates during the recent A1 widening. It's a comparison on the left of the roadways that were, or routeways that were identified, late Iron Age routeways predating AD 70, or thought to. And on the right, we have the Roman roads, and there are lots of them, that appear to have been constructed around about AD 70 and in the few years following it. I have to say that some of the dating here is a little bit speculative, but we are only looking at a few years, so being precise is not easy. I want to draw your attention to a couple of those routeways. The routeways are all the ones marked in green and grey. Sorry, you can see there's an awful lot of them, but I've highlighted three. Starting with routeway 6, which is that way, that one down there. Routeway 6 eventually forks. Routeway 1 comes off it. That's way off to the south. It would have all been too small if I put all of the map on. But the important thing is this section here of Routeway 6 is in almost exactly the same place as the later Roman road we now know as Deer Street, one overlying the other. They closely correspond, although Routeway 1 does deviate quite a long way from it further to the south. We get a similar thing happening up here with Routeway 3, and you can see very clearly that it's in almost, but not quite, the same place as that purple road. They marked it on here as RR10. It's a bit confusing since the Margery number for this road is actually RR8. I won't say anymore. This raises an interesting possibility. Sorry, I've lost my place in my notes. Further to the north, several miles to the north, eventually the Roman road comes to Piercebridge, which I'm sure many of you are aware of. There's the remains of a Roman bridge there. Indeed, there are two other Roman bridges known at Piercebridge. Most people are aware there were two. Few realise there were actually three. The western one is not on the alignment of the Roman road, and it is thought to be the earliest of the three. Given that we have a trackway heading roughly along the same line as the Roman road, is it reasonable to speculate that that might actually be going to Piercebridge and that we might have an earlier version of Deer Street heading that way? Could this be the same proto-Deer Street that was speculated by Mike Bishop to the south, and earlier by Ray Selkirk to further north? Indeed, could it be the same proto-Deer Street that's recently been identified just north of Ebchester by Bill Trow? That's recently been published in the first volume of our new journal Itinerary, for anybody who's interested. Cheap as chips at 20 quid. If so, this would suggest greater Roman military activity in the late 50s or 60s than has to date been considered. And this could possibly have been in support of the Brigantian elite against potential insurgency. The possibility of a fort at Scotch Corner has also been considered, and you can't read it on here, but that's actually marked as being a possible for this area here. It was just outside the area of excavation, so we're not, and survey, so we're not actually sure, but there is a possibility of a Roman military site there. Returning to this one, I want to draw your attention to that road. This is going to become very important in the last couple of slides that I'm about to move on to. This one marked A. If you look at the right-hand map, you'll see that it is in exactly the same position as this Roman road heading west. That is the Roman equivalent of the A66 heading over the Stainmore. The modern road is here, but they meet up in about half a mile to the west. You'll also see there's a further Roman road, which we didn't know about prior to the work at Scotch Corner, on the same alignment. Now that is aligned with a hill to the east of Northallerton called Bullimore. And curiously, or not curiously at all, there is another Roman road heading up from York which changes alignment on Bullimore at precisely the same point as that a road appears to be aligned on. That would be a huge coincidence. The inference is that this pre-Roman or pre-AD 70 trackway is actually using that alignment, which would mean that the Roman surveyors had already done their survey before that was built, which is a very interesting point. Do we have any other evidence to suggest that could be the case? Well, maybe we do. I'm going to come back to it in just a minute. Before I do, talking about the distances again, this slide somehow managed to get slightly out of place, but never mind. We have the two potential routes that we've talked about. The first one through Rowell, and as I said, they are very, very regularly spaced. The second route is only actually 3.5 miles longer, even though it's skirting around the Humberhead levels. If you combine the first two, Osmondthorpe and Pearlthorpe, as I have done there, then you will see that the distances are well within the range for a day's march and the normal spacing of Roman forts. I'm mentioning Pearlthorpe because we're about to embark on a project there, a large geophysical survey. We're not sure exactly what we're going to find, but if anybody's that's in Nottinghamshire. If anybody's interested in getting involved in that, please contact me. The last slide I'll show has my email address on it. Feel free to use it. Right, back to that road heading west. Now, this is a Lidar plot. In 2014, Bryn Gethin, who works for Warwickshire Archaeology, colleague of mine, identified a probable Roman camp from Lidar imagery on the opposite side of the A66 to the Roman fort at Greta Bridge. The fort is just down there. If you look closely at it, you can just about make out the southern rampart, and there are these little blobs outside what we think are gateways, and I'll come back to those in a second. The curious thing about this, though, as you can see, it's in the angle of the River Tees and the River Greta, but it's on the western side of the River Greta, and this is curious. The Roman army always placed camps within the main watercourse between the camp and the perceived enemy. The closest watercourse here is actually the Greta, even though the Tees is a bigger river, but they're clearly using the Greta for defence. Now, under conventional thinking, since the Roman army was supposedly moving northwestwards in the early 70s from a base in York, any threat should be from up here, from the north and the west, not from the north and the east. So why should that be on this side? In 2019, we conducted a Radiometer survey of the site, and that's it on an OS map. Just to give you an idea of the location, it would have been very easy to put it over here. If you were worried about being attacked from that direction, that is where you would have put it. Clearly, they weren't. Because we're very, very short of time, I'm only going to show you the interpretation rather than the actual plot. The Roman period features are all in blue. They're related to camp defences. You can see very, very clearly a really nice quarter circle corner there. And the blobs that I referred to before are actually features known as tituli. There's one, there's two, and there's the third. And these are defences of a gateway. This is a Roman temporary camp, and I use the word advisedly in inverted commas because it clearly was not temporary. It was intended to be a permanent camp for temporary use. We found very little trace of internal features on the Radiometer plot, although possibly some traces of metal surfaces. Certainly nothing else. What we did do, though, is manage to confirm that this is indeed a substantial Roman military site. That faces east. It's one of a group of four. Running out of time, so I have to be brief. The well-known one is at Ray Cross, right on the top of the Stainmore Pass. Anyone who's driven on the A66 will actually have driven through it. When you get to the top of the hill, there's lots of lumps and bumps on both sides. That's actually the remains of the Ray Cross camp. It's huge, massive earthworks, and this one was the same. We estimate that the earthworks were at least 3 meters high with a palisade on top when they were actually built. This isn't an ordinary temporary camp, it's something much more substantial. And the inference is very, very clear. The position of Rokeby Park here controls access to the Stainmore Pass from the Wear Valley, the Tees Valley and the Vale of Mowbray. And crucially, there is the site at Stanwick, Cartamandua's base at Stanwick. The conclusion we've drawn from this is that Rokeby was built whilst Stanwick was still in operation. Excavation and archaeology at Stanwick has concluded that it was abandoned in the very early 70s, probably around about AD 71, 72 at the latest. But this was built, and presumably the other three further on along the route to Carlisle were built while Stanwick was still in existence. And our wonder is, was this actually built much earlier than everybody thinks, as indicated by the possible road along the alignment coming out of, or routeway should I say, coming out of Scotch Corner. It's very speculative, but as I'm sure you can agree, it's more evidence that there's something unusual going on that we do not fully understand. There is actually quite a bit more, but I don't have time to talk to you about any of that, and I am promised that I might have a second chance to tell you about the rest of it. And we are working on other sites as well over the next year or so, so there's going to be a lot more to add to this. Now, the geophysical surveys that have been done have all been done by a team of volunteers, and I've probably missed a few people out on this list, but I do apologize if I have. These are the ones who have actually taken part in the work that you've seen here. There are others, though, who are now part of our team, including Pandora, who's about to deal with the question and answer session. Now actively working just south of, on a site just south of Aldborough. So thanks to all those. And as I said before, anybody wants to get in touch, please use my email. More than welcome to do so.
Right. Well, thank you very much for that, Mike. I think we've only got time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, I've overrun. Sorry, Pam.
Kay is saying, Are you aware of 2 possible Roman fort stroke camps discovered in 2017 at Dalton-on-Tees on the A167?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I'm very cautious about them, let's put it that way. If they're camps, they're very late. There's no indication of any early activity there, and I am not totally convinced. There's certainly Roman activity, but whether they are military camps, I'm not that sure.
Right. And I think we'll have to make this the last question. One from Alison. On the Berg Wallace route, does Lidar show any features on the far side of the A1?
Lidar doesn't, no. Interesting question from somebody who I think knows the answer to this. It's the Alison I'm thinking of. Very, very briefly, we have actually done substantial geophysical survey on the west of the A1 opposite Berg Wallace, and we intend to do some more. What we have found, there's nothing on Lidar, but there's certainly something on the geophys. There's a substantial ditch, a very large defensive ditch. It's very close to the edge of the A1, and we are interpreting that as the edge of the Vicus, which the Roman road would have been running through. We also did some field walking on the site and recovered over 20 kilos of pottery, which still hasn't been fully assessed. But the dates seem to be pretty much throughout the entire Roman period. So the indication is that there was a settlement at Berg Wallace through the Roman period.
Right, well, I hope we're going to have you back for a second time, Mike. So I think we'll have to close the questions there, and anybody else will have to email them to you. I'll hand back to Bill.
Well, Mike, yeah. Fantastic. Yes, we do need parts 2 and 3. Maybe this
Okay.
I'm certain we'll be in touch to get you organised when we start again in the autumn. But thank you so much for that. Everybody's found it fascinating. I have particularly as well. And all this information, which is a little bit closer to where we are, is quite exciting actually. As always, please, feedback. We really do appreciate that, and we need that to know that we're giving you the right sort of topics. So feedback as soon as we possibly can. Okay, moving on. Well, we've still got some copies of our book. I show you this every time. It's a good read. Give us a ring on 01845 527 717, and we'll gladly give you one, £6.50, including post and packing. We still have a few of Chris Gerard's book about Scottish soldiers captured at Dunbar. It's a bit more expensive for that book, and I'm still recommending Cassandra Clark's historical novels because they're such a good read, particularly in this lovely warm weather in the garden. Okay, yeah, I keep saying this, but our lottery funding has now ended. Donations really are gratefully received. Bank details, Thorntley Street History Group, sort code 206146, account number 03429881. I should know that off by heart, but I don't. Thank you very much to all those who have donated. It's really been brilliant, and it's just allowing us to move on and do other things as well. This is the last in our present series of webinars, and we're going to start again in the autumn, so just please watch out for that. And I'm certain Mike will be just about one of the first that you're going to hear from.
Oh, thank you.
Now, let's have a little think. We're also going to be trying to plan an osteology workshop with Dr. Hannah Russ. So if you are interested in this, again, please ping us an email. This is likely to be held, sufficient numbers coming along. It's going to be held in Thorntley Street Village Hall, which is our little village hall here. It's likely to run between 10 and 3. There's going to be a fee because we have people to pay for this. It's likely to be somewhere around £25. So if you are interested, just ping us an email and we'll just find out whether we can put this on. I'm really sorry that we haven't managed to answer everyone's questions tonight, but if you have a specific question that you want answering, send us an email or send it direct to Mike, and I'm certain he'll come back with you. Back to you, should I say, with the information. And what we can't answer now, we'll address in the autumn. Okay, so, right, as always, until then, keep safe and well. Enjoy the warmer weather that we're having. And hopefully we'll see you again in the autumn. Good night.
Forward to it.